Story 1. Most military bases have at least one building that gives everyone the creeps. At West Point, there are several, but the one that stood out when I was there was the set of barracks we used to call the Lost 50s. They weren't glamorous, not even close. Think peeling paint, flickering lights, drafty halls, and the kind of creaky floors that make it impossible to sneak anywhere without sounding like a herd of elephants. I got assigned there my first year there, and I remember feeling like I had moved into the set of some old horror movie. West Point itself already looks haunted. The campus has this gothic vibe, like something out of a medieval castle, and when the fog rolls in off the Hudson River, the place feels cut off from the world. The Lost 50s were tucked in a corner, older than most of the other barracks, and barely maintained at the time. The joke was that nobody wanted to spend the money fixing them because the ghosts wouldn't allow it. Of course, we all laughed about that, but once you live there long enough, it's not as funny. The first few weeks weren't anything major, just small stuff you could brush off. Doors shutting when nobody was near them, faucets dripping even after you tightened them, and footsteps echoing in the hallway long after everyone had turned in. At first I figured it was just the usual settling of an old building. Plus I was in the engineering program, and sleep deprivation was part of the deal. It was easy to blame my imagination when things felt off. But after a while, the little things started lining up in ways I couldn't explain. One night I was working on a project around 2 in the morning, too wired on caffeine to sleep. I kept hearing this steady knocking, like someone tapping on the wall from inside the room next to mine. At first I thought it was just a cadet messing around, but when I checked the roster later, that room had been empty for the entire semester. That's when I stopped laughing at the ghost jokes. The longer I stayed in that building, the heavier it felt. You know when you walk into a place and instantly feel like you shouldn't be there? That's how the hallways always felt after dark. It wasn't just creepy, it was oppressive, like something was watching you and waiting for you to mess up. I started keeping my door shut and my headphones on, just to block it out. One particular night still makes my skin crawl. I had just crashed after pulling an all-nighter, finally got into a deep sleep, when I woke up to the sound of my door unlocking. The locks at West Point weren't complicated, but you could still hear the metal slide when someone turned it. I shot upright in bed, thinking maybe my roommate had come back early or someone was pulling a prank. But when I called out, there was no response. The door stayed closed, but the sound of the lock clicking back into place echoed in the room. I got up to check, heart pounding, and sure enough, the lock was still secure. Nobody had touched it. After that, the weirdness picked up. Things would disappear from my desk only to show up neatly stacked in my closet. My bed would feel ice cold on one side even if the heating was on full blast. More than once, I woke up to the sound of boots pacing outside my room, only to open the door and find an empty hallway. The scariest part wasn't any one event, but how personal it all started to feel. It was like the building knew when I was at my lowest, when I was most worn down by classes and exhaustion. That's when the activity was strongest. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just stress. But it's hard to rationalize everything when the lights above your bed flicker in perfect rhythm to your heartbeat. There was one night that I'll never forget. I had been dozing off when I felt this sudden drop in temperature. My breath came out white, like I was standing outside in winter. At the same time, every sound in the building stopped. No humming pipes, no creaking floors, just silence. Then came this pressure on my chest, like someone was sitting on me, pinning me down. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. I tried to tell myself it was sleep paralysis, but it felt different, more real. My eyes darted to the corner of the room, and for a split second I swore I saw a shadow leaning against the wall. Not moving, not shifting, just standing there like it was waiting. When I finally snapped out of it, I jumped out of bed, turned on every light I could, and stayed awake until morning. I don't think I've ever been that scared in my life. The shadow could have been my mind playing tricks, sure, but the cold, the silence, the feeling of being pinned down, that was harder to explain away. After that, I avoided the barracks as much as possible. I'd stay in the library until it closed, crash in a friend's room, or do anything to spend less time there. By the end of the semester, I was counting the days until I could move out. The weirdest part, though, is how quickly it all stopped once I left. No more nightmares, no strange noises, nothing. It was like the Lost 50s kept it all contained inside those walls. To this day, I can't tell you if it was ghosts, stress, or something else entirely. But I know I wasn't the only one. Everyone who lived there had their own stories. Cold spots, phantom footsteps, doors that opened on their own. We never compared notes until later, but the experiences lined up too well to just be a coincidence. All I know is that West Point has plenty of history, and not all of it is buried. If buildings can hold on to the past, then those barracks are proof. And if you ask me, the ghosts there don't really want to hurt you. They just want to remind you they're still around. Story 2. I always thought the creepiest part of Afghanistan would be the mountains at night. The endless dark, the way the wind howls through the rocks like voices. But I was wrong. The scariest thing I experienced happened in broad daylight, during what should have been a boring job. At the time, I was working J4 for my squadron, which meant handling logistics. Not glamorous stuff, just making sure everyone had beds, pillows, and rooms lined up for an upcoming operation. We were in northern Afghanistan, far from any villages, the kind of place that already felt abandoned by time. That's where I got assigned to check out a compound we were supposed to use. On paper, it sounded fine. 2 massive towers full of rooms, supposedly enough to house our guys comfortably. In reality, the place was something out of a nightmare. The compound had been empty for years, maybe decades. Locals wouldn't go near it. Our security sweep turned up nothing. No signs of people, no tracks, no movement. Just silence. That should have comforted me, but instead it made the place feel heavier, like it was holding on to something no one could see. After the sweep, I split off from my sergeant so we could cover more ground. My job was simple. Go room to room, make sure there were enough beds and supplies. Easy work. The first 2 floors were uneventful. Dust everywhere, faint smell of mildew, paint peeling off the walls. Each room looked the same, bare, quiet, lifeless. I kept myself company by whistling as I worked, trying to push down that strange tension that seemed to hang in the air. By the time I got to the 3rd floor, I had convinced myself I was just being paranoid. That's when it happened. I was halfway down the hall when one of the doors slammed shut. Not slowly, not like it was nudged by a draft. It slammed hard, loud enough to echo through the entire floor. My body froze instantly. I swung my weapon up and shouted for whoever was there to stop. No movement, no answer. The hallway was empty. My voice cracked the second time I yelled, fear bleeding through without me meaning to. I edged back toward the stairs, every muscle tight, my weapon up, round already in the chamber. The silence afterward was worse than the slam itself. Then just as I was about to step off the landing, another door slammed behind me. That was it. My brain stopped thinking, and my body just acted. I scrambled down those stairs so fast I barely remember my boots hitting the steps. My heart was racing, chest tight, like something was right on my back. When I got to my sergeant, I must have looked pale because he asked what the hell had happened. I told him exactly what I'd heard. Together, we went back up, clearing the floor methodically. Room by room, door by door. Nothing. Every room was as empty as the last. No signs of wind, no broken windows, no footprints, no anything. Just dead, stale air. He brushed it off as nerves, or maybe some weird draft I didn't notice. But I knew what I heard. You can tell the difference between a door closing on its own and one being forced shut. This was deliberate. It felt like something wanted me to know I wasn't alone. After that, I refused to go anywhere in that compound by myself. I don't care how tough you think you are. When a place decides to make its presence known like that, you stop pushing your luck. But the story doesn't end there. Over the next few days, as we got the compound ready, other guys started mentioning little things. Some said they heard footsteps on the upper floors when no one was up there. Others swore they caught glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision, like someone slipping into a room just before they turned to look. No one wanted to be the first to say the word haunted, but it was hanging in the air. For me, the worst moment came a week later. I had to go back up to the 3rd floor, this time with 2 other guys. We were supposed to double-check supplies. As soon as I stepped onto that floor, my stomach knotted. It felt colder than the rest of the building, though none of us mentioned it out loud. The hall stretched ahead, every door shut, every shadow deeper than it should have been. I was near the same spot as before when I felt it. Pressure, like the air got heavy all at once. My ears rang faintly, the way they do before a storm. I stopped dead, scanning the hallway, when one of the guys whispered that he thought he saw a figure at the far end, standing perfectly still. I looked, but by the time my eyes focused, it was gone. The hallway was empty again. No door slams that time, no sudden noise, just silence so thick it felt alive. We finished the inspection as fast as possible and got the hell out. None of us talked about it afterward. To this day, I don't know what was in that compound. Maybe there was a logical explanation, something with the structure, acoustics, or my nerves playing tricks on me. But deep down, I don't buy it. The slams were too deliberate. The silence afterward was too heavy. And that sense of being watched, of something waiting just beyond sight, I'll never forget it. I've seen combat, I've heard gunfire, I've felt the kind of fear that comes with bullets snapping past your head. But none of it compares to the way that compound made me feel. Bullets are easy. You know where they come from. You know what you're fighting. But when a place itself feels alive, when doors slam with no one there, and shadows move without a source, you realize there are things out there you can't fight. You can only run. And after that day, I never went anywhere in Afghanistan alone again. Story 3. When you spend enough time out at sea, you start to realize how small you really are. I was in the Coast Guard, posted on one of the oldest cutters still in service. It creaked at night, moaned when the hull flexed, and had so many strange stories attached to it that some of the crew swore it was haunted. I never put much stock in that, at least not until I had my own experiences. The first time it happened, I was standing helm watch in the middle of the Bering Sea. That place is unforgiving. Endless water, icy winds, nothing but waves and fog as far as you can see. The feeling of being truly isolated hits you in the gut. I was steering the ship when radar lit up with a sudden, sharp contact directly behind us. It wasn't just noise. It was big, solid, moving. The officer of the deck got on the line with the lookout to confirm, and he swore he could see something churning the water, leaving a wake. But here's the weird part. His binoculars couldn't track it because the stacks of the ship blocked the exact angle aft. By the time anyone moved to a better vantage point, it was gone. Radar went blank. The water behind us smoothed out like nothing had ever been there. Our best guess was that a submarine had surfaced just long enough to register, then dip back under. Either Russian or one of ours, maybe testing us, maybe just passing through. That was the logical explanation. Still, the idea that something so massive could come up out of nowhere, stay just long enough to remind us how blind we really were, and then vanish left me cold. I remember thinking how easy it would be for something else, something not human at all, to rise up and disappear before we even knew it was there. The second time sticks with me more though. It was mid-watch, that stretch between midnight and 4 a.m. where time feels endless. The kind of watch where the darkness doesn't just sit outside, it presses against you, thick and heavy. That night was dead calm, but so foggy you couldn't see past the glow of the navigation lights. The horn sounded every so often, vibrating through the ship and into my chest, and each time it went off I nearly jumped. The lookout had just swapped with me, muttering as he left the deck that it felt spooky out there. I laughed it off at first, but as soon as I was alone, the silence wrapped around me in a way I'll never forget. Standing lookout in fog that thick is unsettling. Your eyes play tricks on you. You stare into the illuminated wall of mist, and it almost feels like the fog stares back. I kept catching faint movements, shadows shifting, shapes forming, and breaking apart just out of reach. I told myself it was just the lights refracting, but it didn't feel that way. More than once, I was convinced I saw the outline of a figure standing on the water just beyond the bow. Every time I blinked, it was gone, leaving only mist swirling where I thought I saw it. The worst part was the sound. The ocean has a rhythm, even when it's calm. But that night, underneath the low blast of the horn, I swore I could hear something else. A faint knocking, like hands drumming against the hull. At first, I thought it might be the ship creaking, but it was too steady, too deliberate. Almost like someone was pacing alongside us, tapping as they went. I couldn't shake the thought of the old ghost stories the ship carried, tales of men lost overboard who were still seen walking the decks. Whispers about voices echoing through empty compartments in the middle of the night. You don't think about those things in daylight, but at 2 a.m., fog all around, it's impossible not to. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder again and again, certain that if I turned fast enough, I'd see someone standing just behind me. At one point, I swear I felt the deck shift under me, as if someone heavy had stepped up beside me. I froze, every muscle tense, straining to hear. The foghorn bellowed, and in the pause after it faded, I thought I heard breathing. Not mine, something close, wet, like lungs filling with water. When I spun around, the deck was empty. The watch dragged on, and I never saw anything clearly enough to prove it was real. But the atmosphere of that night stayed with me. It wasn't just being spooked or tired. It was the sense that we weren't alone, even though radar showed nothing, and logic said we were isolated for hundreds of miles. It was as if something in that fog wanted to remind me that the sea holds more than just waves and fish. Looking back, I can explain the radar blip. Submarines are common enough, and mistakes happen. I can explain the shadows too. Eyes get tired, lights bend in strange ways, and imagination fills the gaps. But the tapping, the breathing, the heavy steps on the deck, that's harder. Maybe it was the ship itself groaning after decades at sea. Maybe I was overtired and losing my grip. Or maybe the stories about the cutter weren't just stories after all. Even now, when I think about it, I get a chill. Whether it was a submarine, a trick of the fog, or something that doesn't have a name, the lesson was the same. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, you're never truly alone. Something is always watching. Story 4. Some nights on base felt endless. You'd sit in that little dispatch room, fluorescent lights humming above, radios crackling in their usual pattern, and the hours would stretch on like they were being pulled apart. Most of the time, it was routine chatter, call-ins, checks, the occasional random noise when someone leaned on their mic. Nothing special, but every once in a while, something strange would slip through. And what happened one particular night still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. It started the way most odd things do. Small, almost easy to ignore. Static came through the closed radio channel. That wasn't unusual. Radios picked up interference sometimes, little bursts of white noise that didn't mean anything. But this was different. It wasn't just static. Buried in the hiss, there was a sound. At first, it was faint, like someone mumbling underwater. My coworker and I both froze when we heard it, because we weren't sure if it was just in our heads. But then it came back again, clearer than before. The mumbling had no clear words at first, just this low, garbled tone, like someone trying to talk through a bad connection. It would cut in for a few seconds, then vanish, leaving us staring at each other, waiting for the next burst. And it didn't just happen once or twice. It went on for over an hour. Every so often, the static would spike, and there it was again. Some voice, distorted and half-drowned, pressing through a channel that no one outside our department should have had access to. At one point, the voice lingered long enough that we started to catch hints of what it was saying. The more it repeated, the clearer it got, until finally we both picked up two unmistakable words: "Help me." The way it came through didn't sound like a test or a joke or even a drunk soldier messing around with his equipment. It sounded desperate. It sounded like whoever it was couldn't hold the mic steady. The words dragged out, warped by the static, but there was no mistaking them. My coworker scribbled it down on a notepad, like writing it made it more real. Naturally, we did what we were trained to do. We checked the logs. Every transmission over the radios is automatically recorded, time-stamped, and tied to whichever unit or handheld pushed it out. That's the system. You can't send a message without it showing up somewhere. But when we pulled up the record, there was nothing. No timestamp, no transmission. It was like the last 2 hours never happened. That didn't sit right with either of us. Maybe the equipment glitched, we thought. Maybe it wasn't logging properly. So we went through it again and again, combing the files. Same result. The system was running fine, it just didn't record what we heard. That's when the room started to feel different. You know how the air feels heavy before a storm, when you can sense pressure building up? It was like that. I caught myself glancing toward the corners of the room as if someone else was standing there, watching. The radios went back to their normal chatter, but after what we just heard, even the ordinary static sounded wrong, like it was hiding something underneath. We tried calling other departments, asking casually if they'd picked up anything unusual. Nobody had. According to everyone else, it was a perfectly normal night. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't, because my coworker and I knew what we'd heard. We'd both reacted to it at the same time. We'd both written down the words, and the fact that there was no proof made it worse. Later that night, when the bass had quieted down and there wasn't much else to distract us, the weight of it really hit. I kept replaying the voice in my head, wondering if it was a soldier messing around from some unsecured channel we didn't know about. But if that were the case, why didn't it log? Why didn't it record? And how did it get into a closed system in the first place? Here's the part that kept me up for weeks afterward. About 2 days later, I came in for another shift, and my coworker told me he'd had a dream. He described being stuck somewhere dark, his radio barely working, trying to call out. He said he could hear his own voice echoing back at him, broken by static, begging for help. The same words we heard that night. He laughed it off, said it was just his brain recycling the memory, but I could see in his face that he didn't really believe that. I never had the dream myself, but sometimes, late at night, I'd catch the faintest crackle of static in the dispatch room and tense up, waiting for that same warped voice to come through again. It never did, not once, but the fear of it hung there, in the silence between transmissions. We never reported it higher up. How could we? Without recordings, without logs, we just sound crazy. 2 people claiming to hear voices on a channel no one else picked up. Nobody would have taken it seriously, so it stayed between us. The skeptic in me wants to believe it was interference. Maybe some bleed from civilian frequencies, some freak overlap of signals that happened to line up in just the right way to sound like words. That would explain everything neatly, but I can't shake how deliberate it sounded. Not random, not accidental. The voice felt like it was aimed directly at us, like whoever or whatever it was knew we were listening. Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder if we caught a real transmission or if it was something else entirely. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe the system glitched harder than anyone realized. But part of me thinks about the people who've gone missing during service, the ones who never made it back, and I can't help but wonder if what we heard that night was one of them still trying to get through. I don't know what scares me more, the idea that it was something paranormal, or the thought that maybe it wasn't, and we really did hear someone who needed help, and there was nothing we could do. Story 5. Some nights on duty feel heavier than others, like the air itself doesn't want you there. That's the best way I can describe what happened to me about 6 years ago, working late in a correctional facility while serving in the military. Our post had a control booth lined with CCTV monitors, a constant wall of glowing screens showing every angle of the housing units, hallways, and common areas. Most of the time it was routine. Men walking laps in the day room, deputies shuffling paperwork, people sitting around bored out of their minds. But every once in a while, you see something you wish you could unsee. That night started as slow as they come. There had been an emergency call, which meant nearly everyone had cleared out to respond to it, leaving certain units basically empty except for 1 or 2 people still at their posts. I was watching the monitors flipping through angles when one of the feeds caught my eye. The camera was aimed at one of the housing unit control booths, and I could see one of my deputies sitting there, completely normal. Nothing strange about that. But behind him, clear as day, stood another figure. At first, I assumed someone had slipped back into the booth without calling it in. The figure wasn't moving much, just standing still in that way that immediately feels wrong. I leaned forward, staring at the screen, trying to make out details. It wasn't blurry, but it wasn't sharp either. Almost like my eyes couldn't fully lock onto the shape. I could see my deputy moving around normally, checking his logbook, shifting in his chair. And the whole time this figure just loomed behind him. Something about the image rattled me, so I picked up the phone and called him directly. When he answered, I asked who was back there with him. He sounded confused, said no one was there, reminded me that everyone else was out dealing with the emergency call. I told him to check anyway. He stood up, glanced around the room, even stepped to the back where the figure should have been. I sat there, watching both his movements and the still figure on the monitor at the same time, my skin crawling. He moved right through the spot where the figure was standing, like it didn't exist in his world. The moment he sat back down and picked the phone back up, the figure was gone, just blinked out. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told him what I had just seen. He brushed it off, probably thinking I was overtired or playing some weird joke, but I wasn't laughing. I felt shaken, and my gut told me I'd witnessed something I wasn't supposed to. Still, I needed to be sure, so as soon as I had the chance, I went back into the system to review the security footage. I scrolled through the exact timestamp, eyes glued to the playback, waiting for the moment I had just experienced live. Except it wasn't there. The deputy was there, yes. I could see him sitting, moving, answering the phone. But the figure behind him, the one I had watched for minutes, the one I had stared at long enough to burn into my brain, wasn't in the recording at all. The space was empty, like nothing had ever been there in the first place. I sat there replaying it again and again, trying to convince myself I'd missing something. Maybe a shadow, a reflection, a glitch in the live feed. But I know what I saw. It wasn't some half-second flicker or a trick of the light. I watched that thing stand behind him for long enough to know it wasn't my imagination. The strangest part is how calm the figure had seemed. It didn't rush, didn't gesture, didn't try to interact. It just stood there, still as a statue, like it had been watching him, or maybe watching me through the monitor. That thought is what makes my stomach knot to this day. Ever since, I can't shake the feeling that the cameras don't always just show us what's happening. Sometimes I wonder if they let us glimpse things that aren't supposed to cross into our line of sight. Every time I catch that same camera angle on the monitors, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Even 6 years later, my pulse picks up whenever I glance at it. I've heard people say stress and long shifts can make you see things. And maybe that's all it was, a tired brain mixing static with paranoia. But the fact that I watched it vanish in real time and then found absolutely nothing on the recorded footage is what makes me believe it was something else, something I can't explain away. Some nights when I'm alone on shift and the building is quiet, I'll catch myself staring at that feed again, half expecting the figure to return. And every time I do, I get that same icy feeling crawling across my skin, like whatever it was is still there, waiting for another chance to be seen. I can't prove it. I'll never have footage to show. All I've got is the memory of what I saw and the unease that never left me after it. Story 6. I've always thought of military bases as some of the safest places in the world. They're locked down, patrolled, full of procedures and people who know exactly what they're doing. But that night at Scampton proved to me that there are things you can't explain away with training or common sense. It was around 2 in the morning and I was on guard duty. Scampton isn't just any old RAF base. It carries a weight to it because of its history. Dam busters, bomber command, the war. You could feel that history every time you walked past the hangars, like the walls still remembered what had happened there. Normally, though, it was just another quiet night, the kind that drags on forever, where the minutes feel like hours. That was until the phone rang. The call was about noises coming from one of the hangars. Nothing unusual about that at first. Old buildings creak, the wind pushes against metal panels, and sometimes you'll hear echoes bounce in strange ways. I sent a guard over to check it out, thinking he'd radio back with something boring, like a loose sheet of metal banging in the wind. Instead, his voice came over the radio low and nervous. He said he could hear voices, muffled, like people talking, just out of earshot, and the metallic sound of tools clattering. He swore it sounded like machinery running, as if someone was working inside. I grabbed the keys and drove out there myself, thinking maybe someone had broken in or was messing about where they shouldn't be. As I got closer, I could hear it too. Not loud, but there. An odd chorus of noises that didn't belong. The clanging of metal, the hum of something electrical, and every so often a faint flicker of light leaking out from under the hangar doors. It was the kind of sound that prickled the back of your neck because it didn't match the empty place I knew I was standing in front of. We called in the RAF police dogs, figuring if there really were people inside, the dogs would flush them out. But that's when things started to feel wrong in a way I can't fully put into words. The dog, a big animal trained to charge into situations without hesitation, just froze. He lay down on the ground, whimpering, refusing to move no matter how much his handler urged him forward. This wasn't stubbornness, it was fear. I'd never seen a dog refuse an order like that, not one that had been through that level of training. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Still, we had to check. I went in with the guard and the policeman. The second we stepped through the doors, the air changed. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. But it wasn't just the temperature. The air felt thick, almost like walking into fog, even though there was nothing to see. The best way I can describe it is that it felt like the building itself was pressing down on us, heavy with something we couldn't see. The noises were gone the second we entered, which only made it worse. Outside, it had sounded alive, busy, but inside there was just silence. A silence that didn't feel empty, though. It was the kind of silence where you're hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, because everything else is just too still. None of us said much. We just looked around with our torches, finding nothing but dust and shadows. But the feeling, I've never had anything like it since. It was dread, plain and simple. Not nerves, not caution. Pure dread, like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out. My skin felt cold and damp, even though the air wasn't wet. My chest was tight, like something unseen was standing right behind me, watching. We didn't last long in there. After checking that the hangar was locked up and secure, we bailed. The moment we stepped back outside, the air felt lighter, easier to breathe. None of us argued about leaving it alone. There was nothing physical to report, nothing anyone could write up in a logbook that wouldn't sound ridiculous. But we all knew we hadn't imagined it. It wasn't until much later that I found out what that hangar had been used for. About a year later, I was talking to some visiting Bomber Command veterans. The subject of the hangars came up, and one of them mentioned, almost casually, that during the war that particular one had been used for battle repairs. Damaged planes would be hauled in, patched up, and made flight ready again. Sometimes, though, the aircraft came back with crew members still inside, killed during the mission. If the bodies were too tangled up with the wreckage, or if it wasn't possible to remove them right away, they'd bring the whole thing into the hangar. The remains would stay there until they could be dealt with. That explained the noises we thought we heard. The tools, the machinery, the voices. Maybe it was just echoes of the past replaying themselves, trapped in that building somehow. Or maybe it was just our imagination filling in the gaps after being told about sounds on the radio. Skeptics would say it was nothing but nerves, the power of suggestion, or even acoustics playing tricks on us. And maybe they're right. But the way the dog reacted, and the way that dread hit me like a wall the moment I stepped inside, that wasn't imagination. I've been back to Scampton since, but I won't go near that hangar. Even driving past it makes me uneasy, like the building is looking back at me. I don't care if there's a logical explanation or not. I know what I felt that night, and I know I never want to feel it again. Some people think military service hardens you, makes you immune to fear, but it's not true. There are things out there, some tied to history, some maybe not, that cut right past training and logic. That hangar is one of them, and whatever lingers inside it, I hope I never have to cross paths with it again. Story 7. Nights feel different when you're the only one awake inside a massive building. You start noticing sounds you'd never pick up during the day. The hum of lights, the creak of metal, the way your own footsteps echo like they belong to someone else. I worked as a security guard on the graveyard shift at a meat processing plant, and even though the place was busy and noisy during the day, once the sun went down, it turned into something else entirely. Most of my shift was routine. I'd make rounds, check doors, make sure no equipment was tampered with, and jot down anything unusual in the log. Nothing exciting, nothing heroic. But one night, at about 2 in the morning, things started happening that I can't explain. I was up on the 3rd floor, which was mostly storage rooms and electrical access panels. Hardly anyone went up there. A few offices sat empty, but mostly it was just long hallways that seemed to stretch farther than they should when you were alone. I was doing my usual sweep, checking doorknobs, shining my flashlight into corners, when my phone chimed. At first I figured it was a text, but when I checked, there was nothing. No missed calls, no messages, not even a notification from an app. Just silence. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but 2 minutes later, my radio crackled with static. That's when I froze. Nobody else was supposed to be on the radio. I was the only person on the property. The backup radios were locked up tight in the guard shack, and the maintenance guy who occasionally worked nights wasn't even scheduled. Still, I switched over to the maintenance channel and called for him out of habit, even though I knew he wasn't there. No answer. Then came another burst of static, and this time it sounded like someone was fumbling with the mic. No words, just the kind of muffled noise you hear when someone holds a button down without speaking. I told myself it was a malfunction, but my gut wasn't buying it. I decided to head down to the basement where the maintenance office was, just to be sure. That basement was the last place I ever wanted to go. The stairwell down always gave me chills, and the basement itself was nothing but tunnels and generators, a concrete maze that felt designed to confuse you. The whole walk down, my radio kept hissing randomly. By the time I reached the maintenance office, my nerves were already shot. The door was locked, the lights inside were off, and everything looked normal. I was ready to chalk it up as a faulty radio and turn back when I heard it. The sound of the office door unlocking. I froze. My heart kicked up in my chest as I slowly turned back toward the door. It was still closed, still dark inside, but I knew what I'd heard. I pulled my taser out just in case and stood there debating if I was about to risk my life for a paycheck that wasn't worth it. After a few minutes of pacing and sweating, I finally forced myself to push the door open. I reached inside, flicked on the lights, and saw nothing. The office was empty. No signs of anyone hiding, no tools out of place, no notes left on the desk. Just an ordinary, unused room. I started to breathe again, but before I could relax, the lights cut off. The door slammed shut and locked itself behind me. I whipped my flashlight around, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something moving away from the light. A shadow, but not mine. Too tall, too thin, slipping out of the circle of light before I could focus on it. My brain screamed at me to ignore it, to get out. But my hands were shaking so bad I could barely get my keys out. To unlock the door, I had to turn my flashlight off, and those few seconds in pitch darkness felt like hours. The weight of being watched pressed down on me. I could almost feel breath on the back of my neck. When I finally got the door open, I stumbled out into the hallway, flipped the lights on again, and found nothing there. I locked the door behind me, leaned against the wall, and tried to slow my breathing. My watch said it was around 2:30 a.m. I knew I couldn't bring myself to go back up to the third floor. Not after that. I made my way back toward the first floor as quickly as I could. Every step, I swore I heard faint footsteps behind me, just far enough away to question if they were real. By the time I got to the exit, I was ready to be done for the night. But just as I reached the door to head outside to my guard shack, the radio hissed again. This time, it wasn't static. I heard a laugh. Not loud, not long, just a short, sharp chuckle, like someone mocking me, then silence. I stared down at my radio trying to rationalize it. Maybe it had picked up a stray signal, maybe a driver passing by with a scanner. But when I tried to key the mic to respond, nothing happened. The radio was completely dead. I wrote it up as an equipment malfunction in my log, but I've never really believed that. That laugh, it didn't sound like interference. It sounded close, personal, almost like it was meant just for me. And every time I walk past that stairwell to the basement now, I still get that same feeling, like something is waiting down there, listening. I've worked a lot of graveyard shifts since then, and I've gotten the creeps plenty of times, but that night still stands out. The laugh is the part that gets me. Radios don't laugh. Story 8. When you join the military, they don't warn you about the downtime. Everyone expects non-stop action, missions, training, the constant grind. But in reality, you spend a lot of nights just sitting around, guarding buildings, watching empty hallways. That's when the weird stuff happens. Not out in the field, not in combat, but in those long, quiet stretches where your mind has too much space to wander. For me, it wasn't my imagination. It was Korea. My first duty station was USAG Yongsan in Seoul. The place had history dripping from every brick, and not the kind you brag about on base tours. The Japanese had used it during the occupation, and if you know anything about that time, you know it wasn't pretty. Everyone had their own rumors about old hospitals, hidden tunnels, basements that nobody opened. Most of it sounded like ghost stories you tell new guys to freak them out. But once you've been on post long enough, you start noticing things that don't fit neat explanations. It was an overnight guard shift at the United Nations Command HQ that pushed me over the edge. The building wasn't haunted in the Hollywood sense, but it had baggage. A few years before I got there, one of the NCOS had come in, borrowed a weapon off the guard, and walked out back to the gazebo. He never came back alive. They said he ended it with a single round to the head. After that, the story spread like wildfire. Some claimed to hear him walking the halls. Others swore they saw him pacing outside. I never put much stock in it, at least not until the night it was my turn on duty. The building itself had this sterile, uneasy vibe. Automatic glass doors in the front, security cameras everywhere, and long stretches of polished floors that made every sound echo more than it should. Around 2 in the morning, I was doing my usual routine, eyes darting between the monitors, ears tuned to every little creak. That's when I saw it. On the camera feed, a dark figure was making its way up the ramp toward the front doors. No detail, no features, just the solid outline of a man moving with purpose. The first thing I thought was that it had to be the sergeant of the guard doing his rounds. My stomach dropped because that meant I'd be getting inspected, and I started running through whether I'd logged everything properly. I stepped out of the post to meet him, expecting the usual exchange. The automatic doors slid open with their usual hiss, both the outside and inside sets, like they always did when someone approached. Only no one came through. The cameras had shown him walking straight up to the doors. I was standing right there as they opened, but the space beyond was empty, just the still, dark courtyard. At first I figured he must be screwing with me, maybe hiding out of view to catch me slacking. I went outside, walked a circle around the entrance, even checked the gazebo out back. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement, not even the sound of someone walking away. I went back inside, unsettled. On the monitor, the figure was gone. I replayed the feed, rewound it frame by frame. The shadowy outline was there, approaching slowly, steadily, until it reached the top of the ramp. Then it just disappeared. No turn, no retreat, no fading. One frame it was there, the next it wasn't. I tried to brush it off, told myself maybe the system had glitched, maybe the light caught something weird, maybe my eyes were tired, but the doors had opened. They only did that when the sensors picked up movement right in front of them. That wasn't my imagination. Something had been there. For the rest of the shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hallways seemed too quiet, like the kind of silence that hums in your ears. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps coming from the far end of the corridor, slow and heavy. But when I went to check, the hallway stretched out empty. I told myself it was the building settling, or the old ventilation system kicking in. But the sound was distinct, too deliberate to be pipes or air ducts. By the time morning rolled around, I was a wreck. I filed my report, left out the details I couldn't explain, and went back to the barracks. Lying in bed afterward, I kept seeing that dark shape in my head, the way it walked, the way it vanished at the exact moment the doors opened. And I couldn't stop thinking about that NCO who had ended his life outside the building. If someone's last moments were spent walking through those same doors, would it really be so crazy to think a part of them never left? I refused to take night shifts in that building after that. Day shifts were fine. Nothing ever happened then, nothing beyond the usual monotony. But nights, no thanks. Once was enough. Here's the thing, I'm not the type to believe in ghosts. I always lean on the side of logic. Faulty sensors, camera glitches, a tired brain seeing patterns in shadows. But the part I can't get past is how the doors opened on their own. That system never malfunctions, and it doesn't trigger unless someone is right there. And according to the camera, someone was. The military teaches you discipline, how to follow orders, how to ignore your own fear. But that night taught me something else. Some places carry weight, some stories don't stay buried, and when you're stuck in the silence long enough, sometimes you hear echoes you weren't meant to hear. Even now, years later, if someone asked me what the creepiest thing I ever experienced in uniform was, I don't hesitate. It wasn't combat, it wasn't the training exercises, it wasn't the nights out drinking with buddies. It was a quiet shift in an empty building, staring at a monitor, watching a shadow walk right up to me and vanish like it had never been there at all. And I'll never forget the sound of those doors opening for no one. Story 9. When you're pulling watch at night, time doesn't just move slowly, it feels like it stops. I remember sitting there, sweating in the thick humidity, trying to keep myself awake by going over the checklist in my head. It was the kind of night where the air stuck to your skin, heavy and damp, with no breeze at all. I'd been warned not to step outside the entry control point under any circumstances, no matter what I thought I saw or heard. At the time, I figured that was just standard orders. Nothing unusual about being told to stay put. The first hour dragged. The usual sounds of the night were there. Bugs buzzing, the occasional rustle from the tree line. I tried to convince myself it was just another shift, but there was something about that night that didn't sit right. Around midnight, the air turned cold out of nowhere. Not just cooler, bone-deep cold. I felt it first in my arms, then it spread across my whole body. The sweat that had been sticking to me all evening chilled instantly, and I started shivering so hard my teeth almost clattered. I checked the temp gauge we had nearby. It hadn't changed, still in the high 70s. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a refrigerator, like the whole post had suddenly been cut off from the rest of the world. I kept scanning the woods. Every shadow looked wrong, like they were shifting when I wasn't watching directly. I thought maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks, that whole tunnel vision you get when you're overtired. But then the bugs went silent. That was the moment my nerves really spiked. I hadn't realized how loud they were until the sound dropped out all at once. No buzzing, no croaking frogs, not even the wind in the trees. Just nothing. About 10 minutes later, I heard it. A scream so sharp it cut through me like glass. It came from maybe 10 or 15 yards into the tree line, close enough to feel immediate, far enough that I couldn't see who or what was making it. It wasn't a short cry either. It went on and on, long enough that I could hear the way it tore through the person's throat. At first, I thought it was a woman. It was high-pitched, panicked, like someone being murdered. But the longer it went, the harder it was to tell if it was even human. The pitch wavered, deepened, then shot back up like it didn't have a natural source. My training told me to call it in, but my instincts were telling me not to move a muscle. I froze, hands gripped tight to my weapon, eyes locked on the tree line. The scream lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe longer. I lost track. But it ended just as suddenly as it started, cut off mid-breath, like someone had hit a switch. The silence afterward was worse than the scream itself. No footsteps running away, no sound of something moving in the brush. Just the same heavy stillness pressing against my ears. I strained to hear anything, even the smallest crack of a twig. Nothing came. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe some kind of injured cat or even a fox. They can sound horrific when they scream. But something about this didn't match. It wasn't the kind of sound that echoed through the woods naturally. It was like it had been directed straight at me, like whatever made it wanted me to hear it. I sat frozen for the rest of the night. Every few minutes I thought I saw something shift between the trees. Tall shapes, pale faces, things that seemed to melt back into the dark before I could focus on them. I tried convincing myself it was my imagination, my brain filling in the gaps because of what I just heard. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the worse the unease got. My whole body felt wired, skin crawling, heart hammering, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. When daylight finally broke, it felt like the world came back online. The bugs started buzzing again, the air warmed up, and the shadows lost that crawling quality. For a second, I thought maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. But when the relief of the sun hit me, I realized I'd been gripping my rifle so hard all night that my hands were stiff, fingers aching. I reported it that morning, but the response was flat. They told me no one had been cleared to patrol in that area, and no civilians should have been anywhere near. I mentioned the scream, described how it went on and how close it was. They shrugged it off, said maybe it was a bobcat or a coyote. I wanted to believe them, but deep down I knew better. I've heard those animals before. This was different. It wasn't wild, it was deliberate. The part that keeps me up sometimes is that sudden drop in temperature. I still can't explain that. Everyone else I've talked to insists the weather never changed that night. Just me, sitting out there in the dark, shaking like I'd been dropped in ice water. Combined with that scream, it leaves me wondering if it was something beyond explanation. To this day, I don't know what I heard. Maybe it really was just an animal. Maybe my brain was fried from lack of sleep. Maybe the cold was in my head. But I'll never forget that sound. It wasn't just fear. It felt wrong, like I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to witness. And the worst part? If it really was directed at me, then whatever made that sound knows I was there. Sometimes when I think back on it, I wonder if it was trying to draw me into the trees. If I hadn't had strict orders not to leave my post, maybe I would have gone in to check, and maybe I wouldn't have come back. Story 10. People always expect the strangest things I've seen in the military to involve combat zones, foreign countries, or late-night patrols in the middle of nowhere. But the one story that still makes my stomach knot didn't happen in a war zone. It happened stateside, in the middle of an ordinary shift, in a place that technically shouldn't have even been in use anymore. When I was stationed on base, there was this building tucked away on the north side, marked as Building 472. Everyone knew about it, mostly because nobody ever went near it. The thing had been abandoned for years before I even got there. Word was water damage had destroyed the interior, mold had spread through the vents and walls, and it became the kind of hazard where just breathing inside for too long could land you in the hospital. They'd cleared everything out of it long before I arrived. Phones, desks, filing cabinets. From the outside, it just looked like a plain, half-buried office block, but stepping inside was another story. The air had that damp, stale weight that makes your chest tighten, and shadows seemed to linger in the corners, even during the day. A couple of my buddies had dragged me in there once while we were on post. They thought it was funny to spook the new guy, and honestly, they didn't have to try hard. The place already felt wrong. I remember standing in the doorway, staring at a dark stairwell leading underground, and swearing I felt something colder drift up from it. I refused to go down, laughed it off, called myself superstitious, but I never went back inside after that. Years passed, and I mostly forgot about it. That is, until the night I was working dispatch. I was the desk sergeant, running the radios, phones, and keeping track of patrols. It was around 3 a.m., the dead hour of the night when the building feels emptier than usual, and the walls themselves creak like they're settling into the silence. That's when the 911 line lit up. I glanced at the screen, expecting some drunk soldier locked out of his barracks or a domestic call, but instead the screen displayed the origin of the call, Building 472. At first I thought it was a glitch. Nobody used that building. Nobody even went near it. I picked up anyway, standard procedure, and gave the usual opening line. The other end was nothing but silence. Not static, not muffled breathing, just a click and then dead air. That alone sent a chill down my spine, but protocol meant I couldn't ignore it. I logged the call and sat staring at the monitor longer than I should have. Something about seeing BLDG 472 on the screen felt wrong, like I had just pulled a trigger I couldn't undo. I tried convincing myself it was a technical hiccup, some old line that hadn't been properly disconnected, but I couldn't shake the thought of that dark stairwell and how the air had felt heavier when I'd stood there years before. I didn't have the luxury of sitting with that thought long, because as soon as I started convincing myself it was nothing, the line rang again. Same building, same screen, same outcome. I answered, spoke into the headset, and got silence before it cut off. This time, I felt genuine dread. Phones don't just route phantom calls like that, not at random, not from a location with no active lines. I knew I'd have to send someone out to check. I grabbed a flashlight, clipped it to my belt, and signed myself out on the log. I told myself I'd just confirmed the building was locked up, check for any signs of trespassing, and get back to the desk. The drive out was short, but my heart pounded harder the closer I got. The road out to the north side of the base didn't get much use, and by the time I pulled up to 472, it felt like I had driven off the map. The building loomed in the dark, no lights, no signs of life, just a hulk of concrete half swallowed by the ground. I got out of the truck, scanned the perimeter with my flashlight, and saw nothing out of place. Doors were padlocked, windows boarded or barred. Everything looked sealed tight, like it had been for years. But when I walked closer to the main entrance, I froze. The faintest sound was coming from inside. At first I thought it was wind, but it wasn't steady. It rose and fell, like a low hum. My brain tried to pin it on water moving through old pipes, but I knew the utilities had been shut off ages ago. I leaned closer to the door, listening, and the hum shifted. It sounded less like pipes and more like voices. I stepped back fast, adrenaline surging, because there was no way I was going inside. My flashlight caught the faded numbers 472 above the entrance, and I swear for half a second they looked freshly painted, like someone had just brushed them on. I blinked and the illusion was gone, but it rattled me enough that I decided my sweep was over. I called it in, logged it as secured, and drove back. But here's the thing. That wasn't the last time the calls came in. Every couple of months, right around the same hour, the 911 line would light up again with BLDG 472. Always the same silence, always the same click. It became a pattern, and every time I saw it, I felt that same cold pressure in my chest. Eventually, the base decided to deal with it. The building was demolished, filled in, and the area was fenced off. The calls stopped after that. But the memory didn't. To this day, I can't explain it. Maybe it really was some ancient line buried in the walls that shorted out every few months. Maybe it was kids somehow rigging a prank, though I never saw anyone near the place. Or maybe it was something else, something tied to whatever lingered in that dark basement I never had the courage to enter. All I know is the calls only stopped once the building itself was gone. And even now, when I see a random number pop up on my phone late at night, my first thought isn't that it's a scam or a misdial. My first thought is always, what if it's coming from 472 again?